Hello, folks. Welcome in. Welcome. We've got some folks trickling in, so I'll give them a second to log on. All right, welcome everyone. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get started, get the show on the road. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Morris-Jumel Mansion's Virtual Parlor Chat. It's our first Virtual Parlor Chat back from our Connect 260 series, which was celebrating our 260th anniversary of the Morris-Jumel Mansion. And it is the first Virtual Parlor Chat of 2026, which is a tremendously important year for the nation. And we're just so excited to have you all here with us tonight. So the title of our virtual parlor chat this evening is pulling from our speaker's book title, which is You Never Forget Your First, and we're going to be talking about George Washington's presidency. So just before we get into the meat and potatoes of this evening's lecture, here is a little bit about the Morris-Jumel Mansion. If it's your first time joining us, or if you'd like a refresher, we're celebrating 260 years, but now it's turned into 261. So that's very exciting for us. And the mansion was built in 1765. It's the oldest remaining house in Manhattan. It was listed in the National Register of Historic Places in 1966, and then it was designated an individual landmark in 1967, an interior landmark in 1975 by the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission. It was built on the ancestral land of the Lenape people, and was likely built and funded using enslaved labor. It served as George Washington's headquarters in the fall of 1776, and he made two more visits in 1789 and 1790. The 1790 dinner at the tavern at that time, the house was a tavern, was a real sort of who's who of the founding fathers. It's very cool, and their wives and family members, and more about that on the mansion's website if you're interested. It's a very cool little hidden history of the house. But it also housed Eliza Jamel, who was a self-actualized millionaire in the 19th century. Her story is one of my favorites, so also go ahead and take a look at that. It also was the home of former Vice President Aaron Burr and Anne Northup, who is the wife of Solomon Northup, who was the author of 12 Years a Slave. And so many more people throughout the years. I can't fit them all into this little intro right now. But finally, the mansion became a museum in 1904, and we've been sharing the history of the house ever since. And one of the things that we do is we do some really cool programming and events and exhibitions. But one of the things that we're very excited about, and is a really important time in the mansion's history, is that we are in a period of restoration of our exterior. But that means that there's a temporary closure for a portion of that restoration and accessibility project, which began on December 1st in 2025. And while this is happening, we're still offering our virtual programming. And the next session is on February 18th, same time, same channel. We're going to have folks from the Lefferts House who are doing really in-depth and intense research on enslavement in New York City come onto our virtual parlor chat and speak a little bit about that for Black History Month. And while we're also closed, we're doing something called our Uncovering Uptown History walking tours. Weather permitting, we're out there on Saturdays in February. We started them in December, but we're out there in February, starting at 10:30 a.m. and 1:30 p.m. But Keep in mind, no 1:30 p.m. tour on the second Saturday of each month because we have our Family and Community Day. And this February, our Family and Community Day falls on Valentine's Day, February 14th. It's still continuing in the basement of the mansion. So if you're interested in crafting, if you have little ones, and you're looking for something free to do on a Saturday, come and check that out. I believe that we're going to be making Victorian Valentines. So if you are looking for a fun thing to do on Valentine's Day with the family, come on down. Another thing that we are very excited to be doing is partnering with some other local uptown nonprofits and locations. So we're going to be at Trinity Cemetery Chapel, which is actually in the cemetery where Eliza Jamel is buried. And there are going to be 2 offsite concerts with Wildline, a chamber orchestra group called Still Here 1 and 2. February 28th is going to be celebrating Black History Month, and March 27th is going to be celebrating Women's History Month. So we're really excited to host that at Trinity Uptown. So, like I mentioned, the Morris-Jumel Mansion is in a really interesting, abnormal, and crucial time in its 261-year history. We are currently temporarily closed, like I mentioned, and it's really crucial for the mansion to replace those operating costs that we're missing during the time of our closure. And one thing that is really exciting is that we have a GoFundMe with the potential to match anything that we make up to $15,000. We just need about 9,000 more. And so we need all the help we could get. It's really crucial. So that way we could keep providing community focused and oriented events for free of charge, and keep the mansion's history and our nation's history at the forefront of people's mind, and keep sharing that with people and visitors from all over the world, all over the nation, and particularly in New York City. And so if you are feeling generous and you want to help us out, please go ahead and scan that QR code to access our GoFundMe. You can read a little bit more about what the funds will be going to. And thank you in advance if you choose to do so. We really appreciate it, and we really need your help right now. So it's a very crucial time in terms of the Morris-Jumel Mansion's history. But now a little bit of a logistic aspect to our lecture this evening. You'll see that there is a Q&A portion of the lecture, the webinar. And so we encourage you to input your questions that you have for Alexis, our speaker, at any point as they pop into your brain throughout the webinar. Don't be shy. I'll come back before the end of the webinar and ask those questions to Alexis. And it'll be kind of an interesting two-way conversation with the lecturer for the evening. So don't be shy. Remember to put those in at any point throughout the lecture. And now here we are for the main event. I'm very, very happy to introduce our speaker, Alexis Coe, and I'll go ahead and read her bio just to introduce you all. Alexis Coe is a presidential historian, an award-winning New York Times bestselling presidential historian, and a senior fellow at New America, a bipartisan think tank. In July 2025, Coe became the American history columnist at the New York Times. She is the leading presidential biographer of her generation, known for unique insights, engaging style, rigorous scholarship, and ability to reach large, diverse audiences in different mediums. Her books have achieved critical and commercial success, and she is the author most recently of You Never Forget Your First, a biography of George Washington. And so now I'll turn it over to you, Alexis.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you all for coming. I think we're all actually quite glad that this is virtual. It's lovely to be in person, but it is very, very cold. And it's nice to be back at the Morris-Jumel Mansion. I was just saying that I did a great event there a couple of years ago, and it involved ice cream and being outside and warm weather. And so when you reopen, I would very much like that. Today, I'm going to talk about George Washington and the presidency, but I'm going to focus in particular on the invention of the cabinet and on factionalism, what we today would call partisanship. And I think that it's nice to do that at this particular time when it feels like rampant partisanship is a threat to democracy or a threat to the constituents' interests, because history has a wonderful way of telling us not that it's going to be okay, but that it was never okay. And so I'm going to bring you back to November 26th, 1791. George Washington invited Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, Henry Knox, and William Randolph to meet in person. And he had come to believe that the two Virginians, one New Yorker, one New Englander, would give him the best range of viewpoints that he could get. So notice that I left out a name there that you would think would be included, which is John Adams. He was definitely never included. He said when he was the vice president, he's the one who sort of invented this irrelevance, as he called it. And he did so because he tried to invent his own title for George Washington. It included His Excellency, Supreme Commander, and about 10 other words that smacked of monarchy, which was sort of, not the point after that long war. And so he'd never shaken this early reputation for loving all things monarchical. And the latest gossip was actually that at this time, that he rode no fewer than 6 horses, as if he was the member of a royal court. And so Washington's cabinet, again, it's Jefferson, who's the Secretary of State. He went to College of William and Mary. His occupation before the Revolution and during and after until his death was, of course, a plantation owner, so forced labor camp. During the Revolution, he was the Virginia governor and delegate at Congress, and he lived in Virginia. Henry Knox comes from Boston and Maine, and he's, I have to say, one of my favorites. He's Secretary of War, self-educated, a bookseller, so, obviously like him. And during the Revolution, he was an artillery commander and general. And so he had worked with Washington on the Council of War. So far we have Jefferson and Knox. Knox has worked with Washington before. Jefferson has been out writing beautiful screeds and he's raising money abroad, but this is his first time really working with Washington when the actual government starts. So we had, of course, the Continental Congress, and then you have early Congresses and interim presidents. But as long as we have the Articles of Confederation, everything's just an absolute mess. And so this is the first time they're really figuring out, how does America work as a sustainable government? It was a soft launch. This is the hard launch. Of course, Alexander Hamilton is there, the Secretary of Treasury. He went to King's College, now Columbia University. He was a bookkeeper, among other things. And during the war, he was an artillery officer and Washington's aide de camp. He lives in New York City by way of the Caribbean, as we all know from Hamilton the musical. And then you have Edmund Randolph, who is the Attorney General. And I feel like he's the person who people know the least, but he is very close to Washington during his first term. He serves as the Attorney General, as mentioned. He went to William and Mary as well, and he's a lawyer. He, during the war, was a Virginia Attorney General, Williamsburg mayor, and a delegate to the Continental Congress. And he comes from Virginia. So 2 Virginias, Boston, Maine, New York City. So Washington, when we think about the cabinet, I think there's the impression that people meet all the time, and that's just not true. There were 8 cabinet meetings during Washington's first term. And that started in New York, where we are, which was the first residence of the president. And then it went to Philadelphia, the second. And I do encourage you, if you're ever in Philly, to go to the site. It has since been torn down, but the Parks Service did this wonderful renovation, and you have the sort of the bones of the building, and then on the ground you have Ona Judge, who escaped her enslavement, and Washington pursued her until the last of his days, and it's really moving. So the term cabinet was actually coined by James Madison, who George Washington would fall out with, and he would be estranged from him at the time of his death. And Jefferson, this is the battleground. this is where partisanship emerged. This is where you have these diametrically opposed big government, small government. We can't work together. It's also the rise of partisan newspapers. So you essentially have MSNBC, or I guess now it's something else, and you have Fox News. You have CNN and Fox News. And they are, in a similar fashion, these early American periodicals are definitely biased. They're not even pretending they're not. The only difference is you have like a Brian Kilmeade on Fox News. You have, other sort of notable names, but what you don't have in these early American publications are names. Everything is written under pseudonyms, which of course gives you a great amount of freedom. And it also allows you to hide behind a pseudonym. My favorite, by the way, was Porcupine. And so Thomas Jefferson wrote under a pseudonym. And then when Washington would say, Hamilton says you're writing these, he would say, no, absolutely not. I'm definitely not doing that. And then it turns out he was. And I never really understood how it felt to be in these meetings until I found this not often quoted letter from Thomas Jefferson. And in these discussions, he writes, Hamilton and myself were daily pitted in the cabinet like two cocks. So that for me was the most illuminating sentence, perhaps, that I had found in the entirety of my Washington research, because that description turns meetings into a blood sport. And so Washington is then serving as the referee, but he's not really, he's not intervening, because Hamilton and Jefferson are these razor beak competitors. And the whole point of cockfighting is you fight until the death. And so the stakes were pretty high, and that certainly feels, it even feels a bit more vigorous than we see today, which is hard to believe. And by 1792, these fights that they were having in Washington's living room had spilled out of the cockpit. And so Jefferson and Madison, again, these ideological allies, they are writing at a fervid pace for the National Gazette. And what they're doing in these essays is they're criticizing all of Washington's policies. They are attacking Federalist supporters. And this is difficult because what they want to do is come right at Washington directly, but they can't, because in his first term, he was so popular that the people would not abide by direct attacks. And so just as all of the founders and the framers had blamed Parliament for misleading the king, they now blamed Washington's seemingly favorite advisor, Alexander Hamilton, for misleading the president. And so Hamilton is also promoting and, kind of backing a different gazette, and that's a pro-administration paper. And he sometimes wrote for that as well under not a very inventive name, An American. So neither publication, as I mentioned, they're the earliest iterations of journalism, if basically just op-ed sections at large. They don't bother with pretense of objectivity or balance. Most articles, this is commonplace though in early America, so this is normal to the people who are reading them if they can read. Literacy is not pervasive at this point in American history, and so you'll often see this as a kind of social gathering around the publications, and then everyone would gather and they would be read to. And so sometimes this would happen in pubs, sometimes it would happen outside of churches, town squares. It's really exciting because not a lot is going on. None of them were fact-checked. Everything, including personal lives, completely fair game. And Washington, who really did want to be a symbol of unity, he did not declare a political party. He's the only president who didn't declare a political party while in office. He's absolutely horrified. He's very sensitive. But the public actually is loving this. It's so good. It's infighting. It's like a drama. It's all the reasons that some of us love to study this. And all these newspapers are launched all over the country. And so partisanship is inflamed in even the most remote regions. So while Washington, again, he suspected that Jefferson was behind the attacks on his policies, Hamilton was absolutely convinced of it. And so he'd write these letters to Washington constantly. And it's amazing, I don't know when these men slept, because the number of letters they wrote all the time in their own hand, we can tell it's not as much impressive. It is sort of like deeply concerning. So Mr. Jefferson is at the head of a faction decidedly hostile to me and my administration, Hamilton writes. And he is talking about sort of what they believe is good government, and that their understanding of government is dangerous to the Union. This is the kind of thing we hear today, that it's a threat to democracy, to the peace and happiness of the country. So the past is definitely not a foreign country. Now, the situation was so bad that Hamilton became paranoid and he started writing in code. And I have to say that these men were absolutely obsessed with their ciphers. But he did fear that his correspondence might be intercepted and read by partisan opponents. And Washington had led him to believe that he was integral to the presidency. And so Hamilton at this point is actually writing things that would inflame the public, because he's writing things like "my administration," whereas you say the Bush administration, the Obama administration, the Washington administration. I'm sure that Cheney maybe privately said "my administration," but it's not accepted. But Washington still believed that regional prejudices were at the heart of the differences. And this was something that was carried over from the colonial era, because one of the ways that colonies were, that the UK, that the British, that they managed to keep power in the colonies for so long, is they never spoke. They had different currency, they had different dialects. They made sure to isolate them as much as possible. And so after the revolution, it was a little bit difficult for people to suddenly become one cohesive unit. The only thing they could agree on was George Washington. And so he felt like himself, he had worked really hard to rid himself of such regional attitudes during the war. And when he had become fond of Northerners, I think Martha would disagree with that statement. But he did, however, realize the situation was untenable. So what we have now is full parties. Washington, again, not claiming one, but he's fully sympathetic to a party that is no longer in existence, which should be encouraging to people who hope for more than the two parties that we have. He liked the Federalists. And at the time, this was, I would say, more of a pragmatic affiliation than maybe one he was quite passionate about. The Constitution doesn't mention parties. And until 1804, the runner-up of the presidential election was actually automatically made the vice president. So can you imagine if let's say Kamala Harris had won and then J.D. Vance and Trump was her vice president, it would be, it's hard to imagine. Parties were also at odds with Washington's goal of unity. And so two disparate visions for the country are now taken hold, and everyone is thrilled to watch this. But they're also fighting against their neighbor. So we have the Federalists, who were founded around 1791. They like strong federal government. They like Hamilton's financial policies. They interpret the Constitution more expansively. They're very pro-Britain. They're anti-French Revolution for good reason. We didn't want to be dragged into a war, even though they had helped us and we had signed a treaty. But as Washington said, we signed that treaty with a king and queen who were beheaded. And so we have this demographic base for the Federalists, which are conservatives, businessmen, New Englanders, most of the founders. You have Hamilton, of course, but also John Adams, not that, as we've reviewed, matters. They tolerated a lower barrier in the separation of church and state. And then you have on the other side the Democratic Republicans. The exact date is disputed as to where they were established, but Madison and Jefferson seem to have found it around the same time. So these are all emerging around 1791. And it did come in response to Hamilton's financial policies. Madison had previously been a Federalist, but the debt crisis made him switch parties. Their platform was limited federal government, strengthen state governments, interpret the Constitution liberally. They were anti-British as well, and they were pro-French Revolution. Now, of course, this was the party of Jefferson, and he was quite a Francophile. Then we have the demographic base for them. It's farmers, Southerners who wanted stronger rights for the states. States' rights are already emerging. They tended to be less religious and believed more strongly, though, interestingly, in the separation of church and state. So then we have, this is established 1791, these two parties. And then in the late summer, late 1792, late summer, Washington finally addresses these tensions directly. And he basically writes the same letter days apart to Jefferson and to Hamilton. And so the one to Jefferson, which is on August 23rd, he has some small talk. He opens with some light disparaging the Spanish, and then he tells Jefferson in his own way that his infighting with Hamilton is basically ruining everything. He writes, "My earnest wish, my fondest hope, therefore, so instead of wounding suspicions, irritable charges, there may be liberal allowances, mutual forbearances." And then he talks about like yielding on all sides. So he really wants us to sort of work together, because without this collaboration, and this is about as colorful as Washington's writing ever gets, everything must rub. The wheels of government will clog, our enemies will triumph, and by throwing their weight into the disaffected scale, many accomplish the ruin of the goodly fabric we have been erecting. And so he does feel this. He says that a lot, to be totally fair. The American experiment is going to end. And then 3 days later, he writes almost the same thing to Hamilton, but it's in a much softer tone because he's closer to Hamilton. And so he writes, but borrowing the same language, how unfortunate it would be if a fabric so goodly erected under so many circumstances and in its first stages having acquired such respectability should, from diversity of sentiments, brought us to the verge of dissolution. It's a melancholy thought, he says, and it's exclamation mark. He really, I can't stress enough, he's never this emotive. So the men, of course, they respond, and they do so quite differently. Hamilton promises that, sure, like I would love to be, I'm open to healing. I'm open to terminating the differences that exist. I cheerfully embrace it, though I consider myself the more deeply injured party. And then he goes on to list the ways that Jefferson has injured him. And he says, I know he did this. I know he did that. And then he's like, okay, fine. I promise I not directly or indirectly to say or do anything that shall endanger a few. Jefferson's letter was literally 3,000 words longer than Hamilton's. And it ended with quite a mic drop, his resignation from government. He reviewed the many ways in which Hamilton had manipulated and wronged him. He did that as well. He was a bit more specific, which you can do when you're using 3,000 words. And if you think about it, an op-ed is about 800 words. A magazine features maybe 2,000. So the compromise of 1790 is, he really gets stuck on that. He writes, I was duped into it by the Secretary of Treasury and made a fool for forwarding his schemes. He strongly denied any involvement with partisan newspapers. And this is just a blatant lie. He's blatantly lying here. Quote, not a syllable of them has ever proceeded from me. No cabals or intrigues of mine have produced those in legislature. He gave his notice, and he said he'd serve Washington until the end of his first term, and then he retired to Monticello. Washington had the same idea that spring, actually. Jefferson had talked him out of returning to Mount Vernon after 4 years in office. Term limits didn't exist. Washington was just going to call it. And at that point, Jefferson said, no. The North and South will hang. If they hang, they have to hang together, and they have to hang on you. And on that point, everyone agreed, no matter how they felt, even if they disagreed with Washington's policies, as all of the Democratic Federalists did, Democratic Republicans did, they agreed that Washington had to stay in office. And Washington at the same time is completely frustrated. And what's interesting here is you have a woman who does not get a lot of credit emerge as a major influence in the second term. Her name is Elizabeth Powell. She was one of his closest friends in Philadelphia. And she follows up with a dramatic letter as well, because everyone's just writing each other dramatic letters all day long. She wrote, it would be the end of him and the end of the country if he left after 4 years. she wrote, "Your resignation would elate the enemies of good government and cause lasting regret to the friends of humanity, the mistaken and prejudiced part of mankind that see through the medium of bad minds would ascribe your conduct to unworthy motives." And so she goes on. And then this is my favorite. She's like, "You have no idea what you want." The system might be a bad one, but it will be crushed without you. Near the end of the letter, this is when she points out that he's wrong. "Have you not often experienced your judgment was fallible with respect to the means of happiness? Have you not on some occasion found the consummation of your wishes the source of your keenest sufferings?" And so she's referring to this moment in which Washington is retired, one of the many times he tried to retire. And nonetheless, there is this incredible desire to participate. And so what he does is he just spends all his time writing letters and receiving them and bemoaning the state of America and that he'd worked so hard all those years and sacrificed so much. So had Washington left after one term, it would have undoubtedly been on a high note. Madison had written to Jefferson in 1789, "We are in a wilderness without a single footstep to guide us." By 1792, the first president had set up a functioning executive branch. He'd established conventions for future presidents to follow or reform, and for the most part, they have followed them. He'd overseen the passage of the Bill of Rights. He had appointed all 10 Supreme Court justices, 38 federal judges, 28 district judges. He declared the first Thanksgiving. He welcomed Rhode Island, Vermont, Kentucky. He forged armies under the federal regulation. He signed the Naturalization Act, which granted citizenship to any free white person who had been in the country for at least 2 years. That includes women. And I always love to mention that Washington was the grandson of an indentured servant. There were banks. There was an official currency, a Copyright Act, a capital city underway, which he was very involved in, also, not only in the planning as the president, but he was also always trying to make a dollar. This is not particular to the Trumps. Washington was buying up tracts of land. He knew what would be most advantageous because he knew where everything was going to be. But he didn't leave because Washington, then 60, was once again named on the ballot of every presidential elector. So he didn't so much agree as capitulate to a second term, a decision Washington, I think, almost immediately regretted, but certainly by March 4th, 1793, when he took his second oath of office against this backdrop of such immense international unrest, it threatened America's very ability to survive. Washington's second inauguration was somewhat uneventful compared to the first because, of course, no one knew what they were doing there. It was so exciting. There was, I think, a 45-minute firework display. The spring air, which he loved, and he often talked about it alongside these conflicts that were absolutely threatening to become crises. So 2 days after a beloved nephew, George Augustine's funeral, he receives a letter from Hamilton. This is a very dramatic letter. And 2 days out, the reason it's significant is he's still en route back from the funeral. Washington receives this letter. France has declared war on Great Britain. The president has to call an emergency meeting of the cabinet with one question, which I alluded to earlier. Had America's 1778 treaty with France been guillotined a few months earlier along with the king? So Washington felt like it's fine to ignore the treaty. We should declare neutrality. He felt like the country wasn't bound to an agreement that the Continental Congress, which no longer existed, had made with the French crown, which also no longer existed. So America's land forces would offer nothing meaningful to the the conflict because they weren't they had disbanded. There wasn't really a standing army. There were soldiers, but you couldn't fight a war, and there was no real sea force to speak of. So he wouldn't even sign the Naval Act into law for another year. The 6 frigates that were going to be built had not been built yet. They hadn't even been designed. So a declaration of public support would have even been risky at that point, because you have to remember, we're the youngest country. We're stable compared to this age of revolutions that we've inspired. People want to trade with us. There's absolutely no reason to root at all with a war that Washington really feels like, was it honorable? That's for another time. The prospect of war, though, however, was already causing divisions in this young and volatile country. And as soon as the news of it reached America, citizens were very eager to declare their allegiance, because many of them still felt like they were loyalists. So loyalists never really came around to the patriot cause during the American Revolution, but you live in a country, you've lived there your whole life, you're going to eventually accept whatever the outcome of the war is. And also the British and the Hessians had done such destruction to the country that everyone's pretty happy to see them leave. So, but people were actually walking around with the French motto. They were chanting it. They were stitching it to their clothes: liberty, equality, fraternity, which sounded an awful lot like our own liberty, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So they would gather and wear red, white, and blue ribbons, and they would celebrate news of French military victories. And then Great Britain's supporters wore golden eagles, or these black rose-shaped badges. They were just as loyal. They were definitely more orderly than the French supporters. Washington, though, wasn't just being careful. He was being pretty savvy. Neutrality isn't just good for the stability of the country. America has always benefited by staying neutral, at least at the beginning of a war, because you can sell goods to both nations. So the issue actually split the cabinet down the middle. You would think that wouldn't happen. Hamilton, okay, we know he's an Anglophile, but he argued for neutrality, fine. He is often alone in his own corner. He doesn't need anyone in his corner. But on this issue, he had the support of Henry Knox, the Secretary of War. According to Jefferson's notes, Knox sided with Hamilton, even as he acknowledged he's a fool. He knows nothing about it. And then Jefferson, whom Washington had persuaded to stay in as Secretary of State for just a few more months into his second term, surprised everyone, because we know he's famously a Francophile. He voices his support for the French Revolution. He votes for it as thousands of people are being executed in prison. But at the same time, when it comes to trade, he wants to play coy. So his allegiances also have limitations. France and Great Britain should come to them, Jefferson writes, and make them an offer. So American loyalty, essentially, Jefferson is saying, should go the highest bidder. And so on April 22nd, Washington issues this neutrality proclamation. This is a very big deal. He chose not, it's a big deal not only for the country, because all of a sudden economically we're flourishing, but also personally puts Washington in a kind of tough spot, because he loved one of his adopted sons, the Marquis de Lafayette. He named his son George Washington after George Washington. And Washington is supposed to basically house and sort of Washington as he goes to school in America, but he can't receive him. And so he instead quietly arranges for this young Lafayette to enroll at Harvard. He pays for it. He feels so bad. And Washington is cash poor, land rich. He does not like to part with his money. This is a really big deal for him. He's really taking one for the team. And he sends Lafayette to Hamilton in New York. And he basically, whenever there's a break, he's sort of overseeing. Washington, at the same time, is seeking advice from Madison, from the Republican-dominated House of Representatives, even though they know they're going to be really critical of him. and then a few jokes pass between the president and young Lafayette when he finally is able to be received at the president's house. This is all observed by Benjamin Latrobe, who's one of the architects of the US Capitol. In his diary, he says, but this is not a guest. This is certainly George Washington's child. And then he starts living with Washington for 2 years. Jefferson, however, did emerge with this diplomatic win. And I'm going to stop after just one more point that I think is really interesting, because you have more drama. Washington is receiving Edmund Charles Genet, the first ambassador from France. And Genet, when he arrives in 1793, he's supposed to go to Philadelphia. He's supposed to go straight there, pay his respects to the president. And instead, this young redheaded ambassador goes on a month-long anti-neutrality tour from Charleston, South Carolina, all the way up to New York. And he urges Americans to openly defy Washington, whom he described as, quote, a man very different from character emblazoned in history. Thomas Paine, as by the by, would say the exact same thing. So he's pressuring Congress to declare support for France. He's sending privateers to seize British ships. He's wresting control of Florida and Louisiana from the Spanish, who are now at war with France. There's just a lot going on. And they're invoking the spirit of 1776. It works. It's starting to work, which is a shocking development, because again, Washington was absolutely untouchable until one thing happened. A French privateer, hoping to tempt Americans to join them, had the gall to send prizes it had captured into Philadelphia's port. So they had stolen from American ships, the American government, and they sent the goods to the port to sell back to Americans. And even Jefferson agrees at that point, Genet has gone too far. It took Washington a full year to have him recalled. The rifts that ensued from this, despite Jefferson coming to the same side as Hamilton and Washington, were never resolved. They never made up. When Washington died, he was estranged from Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Adams, again, kind of irrelevant, of course, talk to Hamilton. And this is something that I think about a lot during our 250th and during this rise of partisanship and everyone. I think about it in terms also of the friendships that I think have developed over time between different presidents and different political parties. And I think that when we talk about partisanship, we tend to think about it as a relatively recent introduction to American society. Julian Zelizer, a great historian at Princeton, wrote a book called Burning Down the House that I'm just constantly recommending to people. And it's a through line from Newt Gingrich, who is on the board of Mount Vernon and has written also a Washington book. I would not recommend it. Through line from Newt Gingrich to our current state. And I instead argue it starts in 1791. Now I will take your questions. Why is Henry Knox one of my favorites? Please Google him. He has incredible hair. He was a bookseller. He is always, after the war, when he's in government, I find him very entertaining because he's always making the wrong decision. And he's always getting in fights with Washington, but Washington is not fully estranged from him, but he's like so frustrating. And you see it coming from a mile away. My favorite is during the Whiskey Rebellion, right? The first big rebellion. And Henry Knox is the Secretary of War. Knox is like, I really want to be there, but I'm looking at some property in Vermont. And so I'm going to go to Vermont. And then if it's still like a big deal, if you get to the battleground where the Whiskey Rebellion is allegedly taking place, spoiler, it didn't, and it's happening and it's like kind of a big deal. I will come, but if not, I just like, I want to get the survey down. I want to get the permits. And so he's just entertaining because you're like, man, what are you doing? How did you get into this position? And so that's why he's one of my favorites.
Honestly, I think I've adopted a new favorite too.
Do you Google him? It's so good.
I'm going to.
He looks like a crested bird. Let's see. There are no with the Treaty of France I referred to was when during the American Revolution.
So I'll read out the question just so everybody
Oh
can
yes, okay.
hear it, and then just for context, just so we're all in the loop. So what is the treaty with France that you refer to that Washington ignored? And then there's a follow-up question that is, did Washington's ignoring of this French treaty spark the quasi-war between America and France?
Oh, interesting question. Okay. I'm going to take the first one, and I'm going to, just for time, I'm going to move to the Marshall Hicks's question. Very good question. Wonderful. Because that's one that I think is harder to find the answer to. The treaty with France. So during the American Revolution, things were not going well. And Washington actually started a world war in his youth, in his 20s, when he was the head of the Virginia militia. And it's the 7 Years' War also. It's my favorite Washington letter, which really says a lot because it came so early. He gripes about pay and about being a second-class citizen for about 7 pages. And then on the 7th page, he's like, oh, by the way, I oversaw the assassination of a French diplomat. So like now there's a world war. So everyone was already fighting for a long, they were colonial superpowers. So France, Spain, the British, they're all fighting over territories. France agrees to not just loan America money, but loan their military, their greatest minds. So Washington, while we think about him as a great general, as the hero of the revolution, lost more battles than he won. He was not great at that. In fact, had it been left up to Washington, we might have lost the war because Rochambeau, who was the head of the French, Rochambeau, who was the head of the French military, he insisted we go to Yorktown, and Washington was so emotionally attached to New York that he almost won the fight to come to New York, and we would have been ambushed. It was a setup. It was a trap. And so instead we go to Yorktown and we have this decisive victory. The opposite ensues. And so it was essential. Marshall Hicks, do you mind if I just speed? Alexis loved the book. Thank you very much. 2 questions. You mentioned Elizabeth Powell. I thought her letter to Washington was very insightful and compelling. She's a good writer. She's fun. Can you shed more light on her? She seemed very influential at a time when he mostly surrounded himself with male advisors. Second question, what could Washington have done to have lessened emergent partisanship? Or perhaps asked another way, in what way did Washington contribute to partisanship? Okay, really interesting question. I'll take the second one and then I'll take the first one, but I'll also take a sip of water. Washington, I think, by insisting he was not a member of either political party, but very consistently siding with one, invigorated a lot of groups. Their bitterness, it empowered people like Hamilton within government, who was not the easiest to get along with. The cockfights, as I said, they spilled out into the streets, these fights to the death, and then gave rise to newspapers. Would this have happened anyway? Probably. But Washington also was naive. He thought, okay, this worked really well for me when I was the general. I would convene my aides and different heads, and we would talk about strategy. They would argue. And then at the end, I would say, okay, you're done. I'm going to decide what we do from here. And they would accept that because that's how it works in the military. That's not how it works in government. And someone like Jefferson is going to be completely unwieldy in these situations. Now, Elizabeth Powell, this is wonderful. She ran a salon in Philadelphia, which sounds, there's a tendency to dismiss anything that fits that description. Oh, she's just a socialite. Hard disagree. If she had the opportunity to run for office, she would have, and she was very powerful without any power. Her best friend, or one of her closest friends, was Mercy Warren Otis, who was also one of the first women historians in early America. I'm going to have to move on to the next one just for time constraints, but I encourage you to look up an op-ed Zara Enerstein wrote in the Washington Post, I believe, somewhere in the last, 5-6 years. And it's a republic if you can keep it. That line that we all love to use, it is often attributed to just someone or like a little boy outside a building. No, Elizabeth Powell said it. And she's never given credit. She was really in the thick of things, and she had everyone's ear and respect. And you're right, Washington had very few. He was a good husband. He was a very good father to his daughter, Patsy. Almost everyone, by the way, is named Patsy. It's really hard to keep track. But he was not, it's sort of like we all talk about Remember the Ladies with Abigail Adams. We don't talk enough about John Adams' response, which was, "That's so cute of you." He said, "You make me laugh. Obviously, we're not giving up any of our rights. That would be insane." And so I think that is definitely, there's, unfortunately, I believe there's one forthcoming book on Elizabeth Willing Powell, and that is it. So that op-ed is kind of the most we know about her. Everyone loves Powell. This is so great. And then another from Glenn Campbell. Do you think if we had a universally respected leader like GW today, he or she could appoint half his cabinet from the Democratic Party and the other from the Republican? This has happened in our lifetime. There have been members of other parties on if a Democrat has had Republicans have had Democrats. Things have definitely gotten worse, but not as bad as they've ever been. I think that it's possible. As a historian, I look to the past. I don't to understand the present. I don't look to the future. I hope for the future, but it's not something that I'm in the practice of predicting. I think that this idea of universally respected was an impossible idea, and one that had almost completely dissipated by the second term. If you consider the monuments, which I don't like to, in some ways because I have PTSD from all the times that people want to talk about monuments for all those years, but also because they don't tell us anything really. Nothing substantial, but they do give impressions, right? Because you can't fit a lot on a plaque. But if you think about the difference between the Washington Monument, which is a giant obelisk, sanded down, with some edges, a point at the top, visible throughout all of Washington, but has no discernible features, no limbs, no face, no words, right? There's stuff on the inside, it's fun to find, but it's meant to be unifying. It's an idea, it's a concept, and it's one that we talk about as if it existed for all 8 years, and it just simply didn't. As I mentioned, I think a couple times, he died estranged from the other founders. They were frenemies. Then you have something like Jefferson and Lincoln. There's so much. You have their beautiful words. You have their features. And so I think while we want to really subscribe to this idea, even as a Washington scholar, I can tell you it's just not totally true. It's one of these myths, as in the words of Joan Didion, we tell ourselves stories in order to live, and that's definitely true. And I think it should be really obvious. And if it's not, I encourage you to visit the New York Historical. If you're in I know unfortunately the Morris-Jumel Mansion is closed during this time. We're all going to donate to it. But there are many other great exhibitions going on right now that really delve into this. But I'm not sure it ever existed. And I don't think there would be one unifying figure today. I do think that we could certainly respect our presidents more, but they could also be a little bit more respectful, if you know what I mean. I think we probably have time for one more.
Go for it.
So yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you have this Washington backs us into, maybe, if we give him a little bit of credit, didn't know what he created. He's Frankenstein with the monster. We have him creating partisanship. Jefferson and Adams, if he just queued up, I have no sports metaphors for you, but if he queued up the pitch or whatever, then like they hit it out of the ballpark. They were the first people who didn't show up to the next inauguration. So this is really, I think that every president, they pass a baton. They've all made some things much worse and some things much better. So yes, but I don't know if you can just say it wasn't just the Alien and Sedition Act. Everything deepened it. Their personal animosity towards each other, acrimonious situations outside of government, inside of government, during the war, the vestiges of the past. You have a John Quincy Adams, who's introducing his father's issues into his own administration. That doesn't go well either. It keeps going and going and going. And so this is, rather than something that we can just wish away, something that we have to make work for us better, quite clearly. And there are times when it has. And that, I think, is the most uplifting thing that I can offer you there.
All righty. Well, thank you so much for your time, Alexis, and thank you for the two-way conversation with our audience today. Definitely, we would love to have more ice cream out on the lawn in the weather. But thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. My name is Danielle Gaeta. I am the Director of Education, Public Programs, and Visitor Services. Thank you, Alexis. Thank you to all of you who came tonight, and definitely stop on by the mansion when we're reopened in the late spring, and have a good evening. This will also be posted on YouTube for those of you who joined late or just want to watch a wonderful lecture again, and that'll be up within a few weeks. So have a good night, folks. Thank you, Alexis, and goodbye for now.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming. Bye.